all the good neighbors in Johnson County. I am just delighted you're here because I have the most interesting person. His name is Aaron Barnhart, and Aaron has written a book, and it's called Firebrand. And Firebrand is a work of historical fiction. I want to stop just a minute and define historical fiction.
Yeah, that's a good question, Mary, because historical fiction covers a lot of ground. Like, I think the way that we think of it now are these period pieces that are set in a certain time, but all the characters are fictional, and maybe even the incidents that form the major drama of the book are completely concocted in the mind of the author. And so that's one type of historical fiction. Then you have things like historical fiction featuring real people in kind of magical or fantastical situations. Best example of that is probably Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer. You may recall that thing a few years ago. So there's that. But specifically what Firebrand is it's a biographical novel. So it is a piece of historical fiction insofar as I did have to create dialogue for it. But it's actually based on the autobiography of a person that we'll get into named August Bondy. But is actually based on a real person, real story, and all the incidents that happened in it are true. So it's right on the state line between historical fiction and biography.
And it was the 58 novel called Border Hawk.
That's right.
Was what you used to base the story on. And I guess the question is, you know, August Bondy was not only a real person, he was very big in the history of our state in 1858, 1859, and he lived until 1907. So he did a whole lot of things besides come to Kansas about 1858. So the question becomes, how close did you stick to the real August Bondy?
It was easy because his story
he wrote a lot
was so incredible.
Well, and he wrote a lot.
His autobiography that he apparently spent many years toward the end of his life writing, but he never quite got around to publishing. His children published it through a small printer in Salina, Kansas in 1910 after his death. But August Bondy, I always like to call him the second most interesting man in Bleeding Kansas.
Well,
now,
who do you think the first?
Well, so it depends.
I must ask that question.
Some people might say it's John Brown, but then you get all these other people who say John Brown, he was a terrorist, he was a murderer, he was just a bad guy, and we can't elevate him. Jim Lane, on the other hand, that was an interesting guy. This guy he kind of does a Donald Trump, right? He's for the Kansas-Nebraska Act when he's a congressman in Indiana, moves to Bleeding, Kansas, and immediately flips and says, "Oh, this is a free state, so I'm gonna get behind the free state." So he's
not too different from some of the politicians of today, I might add.
He's a real operator, right? Yeah. And a fascinating guy. But I would say that just because of the breadth of his experience, from where he starts as a Jewish teenager caught up in the revolutions of 1848 in his native Austria, to Bleeding, Kansas, to the Civil War, August Bondy, just the first 30 years of his life, are so fascinating. I'm surprised that it takes events like my book and, as you mentioned before, the 1958 historical novel Border Hawk by a guy named Lloyd Alexander.
And then there was a good, really good book written about him some time ago. I've forgotten the name of the author, but there have been a lot of things.
Aaron Kramer did The Ballad of August Bondy, and that was made in, and actually at BAM they did a Brooklyn Academy of Music. They staged it as a mini musical. So, there was a revival in the 1950s after the Holocaust in interest in famous famous Jewish heroes and heroines of history. Yeah. And so during that time, Jewish Publication Society, which publishes basically known for the Hebrew Bible, but they also came out with this series of little juvenile biographies because, well, we all grew up on little juvenile biographies, these things in, I remember the blue-backed books. Friends of mine remember their elementary school library was filled with orange-backed books, but there were these little biographies about famous people when they were young.
But you have to be careful when you write I'm sure you were, but you do have to be careful when you write about somebody like August Bondy, who wrote about himself, and about whom there is been so much written. So you have to be really careful.
The thing about Bondy is that his autobiography is very spare. He doesn't brag a lot. He does claim to be, so in 1848 he's 14 years old, and as many people watching this know, the revolutions of 1848 is Europe's Arab Spring. It's a time when they're spontaneously blowing up across the continent these student-led pro-democracy protests and uprisings, and then they often result in violent clashes with the authorities. And Bondy, who gets recruited into this almost immediately through his friends, one of whom, Heinrich Spitzer, is killed, yes. And that's the dramatic opening scene of Firebrand. But these insurrections, whatever you want to call them, were happening all over Europe, that's right.
Not just in Austria.
That's right. They were popping up all across the continent. In fact, we have a little map, because one of the things I did want to do was make the reader understand, because this is aimed at a reader age 12 and up, and we wanted to immerse them in August's world and make it absolutely clear that this is not made up, that this actually happened, and that Europe was aflame with revolutionary sentiment in 1848, and that August Bondy, by his own account, and because he's a humble storyteller, I find him to be not full of braggadocio about himself.
No, I don't think he was. I think because I've read his autobiography too.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think that he was what he was.
Yep.
And that's the way he talked. But I want to
a man of his times, an
was.
ordinary person in extraordinary times.
There's no question about that, and that's what makes him special.
Yeah.
But I want to pull a thread out of something you said, and you're writing for the youth market. This is a burgeoning field. And you have chosen to enter in.
Yeah.
And so I think that's interesting.
Diane and I, my wife Diane Eichhoff and I, started a little history publishing press back when I was still the television and media critic of the Kansas City Star about 10 years ago. And we did it because she had spent 6 years writing a biography of the woman we call the mother of Kansas, the first feminist of Kansas, Clarina Nichols. And that book, and you have the later edition of it, but that woman right there on the cover.
I wouldn't be pleased with anything less than the latest edition.
Is Clarina Nichols. And when Diane first did the biography, she was aiming it at the general history market. And the average history reader, I think people know this by now, tends to be a person who likes PBS. They tend to be 50 years or older. And these are the people who buy a lot of history books.
And then you did another one, too, on Tilly Pierce.
That's right.
We might as well talk about Tilly while we're doing it.
While we got the camera zooming in on covers here.
Yeah.
Tilly Pierce, as the cover says, was a teen eyewitness to the Battle of Gettysburg. And again, the thing that's so valuable about each and every one of these persons is that they wrote down accounts of those things that happened in their life. And getting back to Bondy, he goes to the United States after the revolutions, while the revolutions are still going on, because essentially his parents his father's a businessman, he's in the import-export business, and once Austria, erupts in revolution, he can't conduct business anymore.
No.
And so he has to get out.
And you know what's kind of interesting about this whole thing? This happened 1848 or thereabout. But the things that you talk about in the book as it relates to Bondy are very germane to things that are happening today. Just like you spend some time talking about the trip to America and some of the difficulties that new immigrants face, the language, finding a job, getting settled, where do you live, all that kind of, that's just as current today as it was then.
Absolutely. And it is amazing. Gore Vidal called us the United States of amnesia, and it is amazing how we forget that we are built by immigrant labor, by immigrant stories, by immigrant sacrifice. Now, the thing that makes Bondy's story so compelling is that on top of all those other things, he comes over, he doesn't know English, he doesn't know anybody, he has to get a job, and he's left all of his friends behind in the revolution. They're still fighting the revolution, and so if there's a fiction in this book, I'm trying to put myself in the mind of a 14, 15-year-old who's ripped away from all this. I mean, he's had friends killed on the streets of Vienna, and he claims to have been the person who raised the first barricade, where they took the stones out of the cobblestones out of the street and stacked them high and pushed furniture up and basically created a wall between them and the king's army.
That's sort of like Les Miserables, you know,
Yes.
where they wave the flag on top of the barricade. See, history does indeed repeat itself.
Yes.
And I would venture to say that he and his friends Weiner and Benjamin came to Kansas because they were, you know, Jews in those days were in the soft goods business. And so they came to Kansas because the army was there. I mean,
Yep.
they're following the trade routes, as it were.
That's right.
And so they came to Kansas. And this is a funny, which you did not mention in the book, but they were three little guys who had never ridden a horse, never done anything. And they came from St. Louis to Kansas in a wagon full of goods and two oxen pulling.
It's just amazing.
And
no advanced scouting, no nothing. Just
No,
a
they
guy
just got-
saying, maybe over by Mosquito Creek you can find
That's
something.
right.
And then they just sort of point
That's
their
right,
horses
and
that way.
they were oxen, and they had never undone them, so they left them hitched up the whole way because they couldn't get them rehitched if they
That's
let
right.
them loose.
Yeah, they were oxen.
And so so I mean, that shows you. I guess if they'd been older and wiser, they would have had less courage.
That's exactly
I don't
right.
know.
That's exactly right. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so appealing is
Yeah.
because it is, kids love reading about a big adventure. And then for the older reader, it's this life of August Bondy that really is never repeated again. It's a singular moment of time, this ordinary person caught up in extraordinary times. And one of the things that makes his immigrant experience different is not just what he's leaving behind, but the first thing he sees. And Mary, this was not in the version of the story that was dramatized 60 years ago by Lloyd Alexander. I started with Lloyd's book, Border Hawk. I thought he did some wonderful dramatic scenes. That opening scene where where the first confrontation and the barricades being built in the town square in Vienna, those were extremely dramatic scenes. But what struck me was, what was it like coming over to the United States? And the scene that really jumped out for me, it's in his autobiography, and I was just reading it, and it's like 2 or 3 lines, because that's the way that August writes. And he says, yeah, we landed in Louisiana, and we had to wait because we were on a sailing ship. They still took sailing ships to the United States back then. And we had to wait for a tug to pull us into the port of New Orleans.
Well, that's right, because Ellis Island was not there.
That's right.
Then, so they came in.
And if you're coming to St. Louis, you go to
and
New
then
Orleans.
they went right up the Mississippi to St. Louis.
That's right. And so the first thing he sees in the United States is a sugar plantation. They say, you know, we got some time while we're waiting for the tugboat to come. Why don't you go down and take a look at the sugar mill? He goes in, and for the first time in his life, he sees African slavery. Now, can you imagine this kid fighting for freedom in Austria?
Well, he may not have ever seen an African.
Comes over to the
before.
United States, and they're in coffee sacks. They're just, these guys, it's like they came right off the boat, and they stripped them and cut out a hole in a coffee sack and put it over their head and said, now go to work.
Well, and you know,
Amazing.
isn't it interesting? And I think this is another thread that young people need to pull out or have pulled out for them, that incidents in one's life can often change the whole course of their future. And I think that made a big impression on this young man. And also, when he came to Kansas, you know, Mosquito Creek is right by Blackjack, which is about 5 miles this side of Baldwin. And there again was a fortuitous or not incident.
That's right. One of his neighbors is John Brown. The whole Brown clan is there.
And he met his sons.
And yes, exactly right. It's really the Brown sons who are the great support to the Bondys.
Well, I think it was Theo particularly, was it not?
And then Theo Weiner coming over, this big guy who's from Poland.
Yeah.
So it's this motley collection
people.
Of people.
And we would have thought they were a motley collection too had we taken a look.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As you said, no business riding a horse. They never opened a dry goods store, and they're opening one in the middle of nowhere on the prairie.
And that is still nowhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it's...
But you bring out a good point with Blackjack. You know, the Battle of Blackjack, we now understand as the first place where the Civil War broke out in armed warfare. It's the first place where pro-slavery and anti-slavery militia trade blows on a battlefield. And it's there 5 miles east of Baldwin, but it took until the end of the 20th century for the locals there to buy up the land and to begin to improve it, and only in the last 3 years has that site gained National Historic Landmark status.
And that's true. And the battlefield, you really need to go see it.
Absolutely.
Because the battlefield is it's not, you think it's going to be huge, and it's not, but it's very well marked. I mean, literally, they were firing in each other's faces.
Yep.
But it is very well marked, and you can walk around. The battlefield committee takes very good care. There's a house next door
which
that's
they've
open.
improved as well.
They have very much improved it. But I also think that you call him Dutch Bill, but it was Dutch Henry
That's right.
at Mosquito Creek. And Dutch Henry had kind of a saloon, a bar, or whatever.
Yeah.
And
which
so,
James McBride in his book, The Good Lord Bird, which is very much a historical fiction about John Brown. But Dutch Henry it becomes a living character in his saloon in that book. So John Brown lives on in story and myth, and really what I wanted to do was take this person, August Bondy, who in many ways has as compelling a story and has some decisions to make. Because there are crucial points, and we dramatize this in the book, there are crucial points where John Brown wants to go even further in his prosecution of the sinners who have advanced slavery and want to bring it into Kansas. So he wants to go one way with his crusade. August Bondy does not want to be part of that crusade. And it's a battle of his conscience.
I wanted you to see him. He's a little guy.
Yep.
And but there he is in his Civil War uniform.
Yeah, he joined the 5th Kansas Cavalry. So he takes part in the three great freedom struggles of his day, the revolutions of '48, Bleeding Kansas, and the American Civil War.
And he is buried, by the way, in Salina. And if you're in Salina, go to the big cemetery. You can see his grave. He has a daughter that's buried in the Jewish cemetery in Leavenworth.
That's right. They had 9 children, and so they're from between here and Galesburg.
Yes, and his wife was from Leavenworth.
That's right. It was from Leavenworth,
yeah.
Einstein.
But you know, and you talk about the burning of Lawrence. You know, in this book, it's not a big book, but in this book is a lot of opportunity for further reading, further comment, further discussion, and I think that makes it the right kind of a book for young people to read.
This is what we're trying to do with our company, Quindaro Press, and people have been seeing up on screen. I'm the publisher of Quindaro Press of Kansas City. This may be the last book I write for a while because we're putting out 4 books a year now. We've signed a number of authors to explore themes for us, but what they all have in common is we're trying to spark a curiosity in history with the next generation of readers and leaders. You know, we understand that schools are under a lot of pressure. They don't teach history very much, and when they do, it often tends to be, we got to check these boxes. Yeah. And so it tends to, you know, history in schools often becomes a collection of acts and facts. And the only way you can counter that, Mary, is to tell a good story.
We have to tell a good story, and it's really tough to hold the interest of middle and high school kids.
Yep.
And it's hard to write a book that appeals. And I think, you know, what is it, if we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it.
That's right.
And we know that it's been repeated a number of times. And some of the threads in this book, you talk about immigration.
Yep.
Think of the problems we're having with immigration now. Mm-hmm. Probably worse than any. You talk about freedom, you talk about
the revolutions of '48. You know, when
slavery, you talk about slavery.
You know, people talk about the Arab Spring being, on the whole, a failure. What did we step into, getting involved in all these countries? And the reality is that most of the revolutions of '48 ended in failure as well. There was violent pushback by the authorities, but the seed was planted. And Europe, by the end of the 20th century, by the end of the 19th century, Europe is a vastly different setup. It has a lot of nation states, non-democratically elected principalities and powers are increasingly elected.
Well, and to push that angst, if you will, a little farther, World War I
yes.
set. I mean, that was coming up, you see, and during World War I, that was the end of the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And the end of the Ottoman Empire resulted in the creation of some of these countries in the Middle East.
Right, we're on the 100th anniversary of,
that's
the,
right,
the mapping out of that of the entire Middle East region.
Yeah, and the Treaty of Versailles, no one was really prepared for the policy. Policy is the name of the game, and policy is
That's right. But if you're 14
lacking.
years old and you have all of these fantasy novels, you have all this fiction, these dystopians, these stories that are fictional in nature to choose from. And this is an explosive market. It's the only, young adult is the only market that's grown double digits year after year after year. And there are stories galore. So you've got a lot of things to choose from. And the proposition we're making is this: real stories are the best stories.
Well, and they are.
But to do that, you have to be able to tell the story well.
Yes, you do. The other thread that you put in your book is Judaism, and that leads to a discussion of the great religions of the world and the history of those religions. I mean, think of the roots that can go out from this tree that has been planted about this man who was an ordinary man and doing extraordinary things, as you very well point out.
That's exactly right. And throughout history, you know, the Jewish people were largely were often a marginalized people and were not allowed to hold positions of authority and power. And so the great heroes were the ones who often were the rebels, the renegades, the firebrands.
The firebrands.
And August Bondy definitely saw himself in that tradition of the great Jewish.
Do you think he
heroes.
saw himself or he found himself in that tradition?
That's a good distinction. I would say he found himself in
I would say that too.
He was a humble man. We don't think that he was that observant of the Jewish custom. And Lloyd Alexander.
Well, he couldn't be.
Exactly. He's out on the prairie. They were very happy just to be able to nail the mezuzah to the door, and that's right. And you know, and a few other, and to have the cups for the special.
But he did what he could
for the special meals, and family was very important. So they did all that they could on the prairie in this new country. But you know, on the whole, when you see that their religion is important to them, but so are taking stands in society, because ultimately, when you're getting young readers interested in history, they're a few years away from getting interested in policy. Really, what it comes down to are those binary choices. Am I going to take a stand for good, or am I going to take a stand for the status quo? Am I going to, you know, the moral arc of the universe? Theodore Parker, as quoted by Martin Luther King, the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. Am I going to be on the front end of that arc, or am I always going to be following?
Well, hopefully, well, there are fewer people on either end, but there should be a lot of people in the middle who are willing to stand up and be counted with their vote.
Yes, yes, exactly right. And part of what the battle for Free State Kansas, of course, was for fair elections. And it's ironic that Kansas has become ground zero for the voter ID movement when in this state, you know, the very beginnings of its territorial years was marked by extensive and rampant voter fraud.
Well, my father always said, my father was a Kansas Citian as well, and he always said that they just went from polling place to polling place, and they voted all the dead people in the cemetery. And
Chicago had nothing on Bleeding Kansas.
No.
So
you see, you know, we make changes, and they're sometimes slower than some of us would hope. But along that line, let's talk again and underscore what it is that is a must for the books that you are publishing.
Well, they have to be real.
Press is publishing.
They have to be real stories. So even though I had to get in the mind of a 14-year-old for Firebrand, Tilly Pierce is based on the actual account of a girl who was 15 years old when the Battle of Gettysburg spilled into the streets and homes of the town of Gettysburg. Clorinda Nichols is based on the newspaper articles, speeches, and other contemporaneous accounts of this woman, Clorinda Nichols, who was one of the singular women of the 19th century and who spent her most fertile time here in Bleeding, Kansas.
3 cheers for the girls.
3 cheers for the girls. And we've got, and from the same author of Tilly Pierce, Tanya Anderson, we have a book coming out this fall called Gunpowder Girls. And it's a story that's never been told before, because that's the other thing we're looking for. We're looking for hidden history that tells you about the history of social justice in this country. So in the case of Gunpowder Girls, few people know that there were these girls and young women, some as young as 10, who were put to work in these arsenals during the Civil War, packing ammunition with very highly volatile explosives. This was very dangerous work. They were ill prepared for it and often met with very sad and unfortunate consequences. But for me, what appealed to me about it was, yes, it's an incredible story that people read histories of the Civil War don't even know about. One of the worst explosions that ever happened involving these young women happened on the same day as the Battle of Antietam. So you can guess what got the newspaper coverage.
Oh,
and
well,
what
there's no question.
And what didn't.
But I think it's fair to say, too, that you are picking strong people.
Yes.
That have a mission in life that is either chosen by them or for which they have been chosen for some reason. And they have followed through with style and grace, if you will, and panache as well thrown in. So I think that these are people that, even though we don't know a lot about them, are people that in their own time were agents for change.
This may sound funny coming from somebody who spent his years as a television critic covering Hollywood and the TV industry, but I'm not a big fan of celebrity. Famous people don't do a lot for me. I was never pining after those interviews at parties with the stars that I would be invited to when I was out in LA. But ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We're all participants. Anyone is capable of making history. And if we can get the kernel of that idea in the mind of a young person, I think we'll have accomplished a lot with this Quindale Press.
And those are the people whose stars stay bright.
Yes.
And there are many who everybody knows their name, but they're a bit of a flash in the pan.
Yeah.
And I think that the bright stars are the ones that we need to follow.
Yeah, that's lovely.
I do. And I think that I really congratulate you. You know, you say, well, I'm reading teenage books, but it was a very good book, and I found in it so much that was hidden between the covers of the book to be pulled out by parents, children, grandparents, anybody. There are many kernels and seeds to be planted and sprouted, I believe.
Yeah, and as a friend of mine who runs a young adult book club says, whenever a teenager walks through the door, we all get excited because the average reader of books for teens is about 30.
Yeah. Well, they missed on me.
And up.
That's right. So take a look at Firebrand. One of the reviewers said it's likable, teen-friendly, accessible, and historically rigorous, refreshingly different, gripping and involving from start to finish, and I second that. Aaron Barnhart, thank you for coming to see us and being a part of our community. Come back soon. I love having you.